Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have numerous Russian advances and a single Ukrainian recapture. We start out in the city of Krasnohorivka, where the Russians have managed to make a strong push here in the east, capturing the rest of the apartment complex areas here in the southeast of the city, as well as the hospital area and the apartment complex in the northeast. This allows the Russians to capture every single fortified area within the Ukrainian positions here in the city of Krasnohorivka, significantly improving the Russian positions in the area and starting the beginning of the end of Krasnohorivka. We see that all the fighting that took place prior to this was according to the Ukrainian defensive and fortified positions, followed up by the industrial area, followed up by the apartment complex area, and now we have moved completely into the residential area. The Russians are now fighting within the residential area, and the Ukrainians are now fighting within the residential area, with no major areas where the Ukrainians can set up a defensive line. The closest thing we can come to it is there is this marsh area here in the center, which the Ukrainians can use as a defensive line, in the sense that the Russians would be forced to push here in the western direction of the city, as it would be difficult to concentrate forces in the northern direction. There is the possibility of the Russians launching offensive operations here from the east, but again, they still have the final fortified position here, and they can also concentrate and create a defensive line to the north. So the Ukrainians can defend in the northern parts and the concentration of forces here to the west. But this is the interesting part of the city of Krasnohorivka, and that is there is this major open area here to the west. This means that the Russians can start fighting in that direction and open up a wider front here to the west. This means that the defensive positions of the Ukrainians here within Krasnohorivka are all under Russian hands now, and it is virtually undefendable. The Ukrainians are now only able of slowing down the Russians. They're not capable of stopping them, and they're not capable of launching counterattacks that will allow them to recapture positions. Krasnohorivka is now going on a straight line to defeat for the Ukrainians. In the Avdiivka section of the front line, the Russians have advanced in three separate directions, two of them in the direction of Novomykhailivka, Persha, where the Russians have managed to capture the fortified position of the Ukrainians north of the town, and to the east the Russians have managed to reach the outskirts of the town via advancing here in the eastern parts of it. So we see a push from the east and to the north of Novomykhailivka, Persha, where the Russians now have full control over the northern part of the town, leaving no areas under the Ukrainian control except by across the river line. This means two things. First off, the Ukrainians would have a difficult time resupplying and reinforcing Novomykhailivka, Persha, as the only supply lines capable of doing so is directly under Russian fire control to the north, and then there's a second line that is a bit wider, but it is usable. But again, this is the only line to supply the town itself that is somewhat secure, but is still under Russian artillery fire. And if the Russians use air force, whether it be jets launching FAB bombs or helicopters firing from afar, they are capable of using those as well at the Ukrainian supply route. At the same time, the town itself is being heavily bombarded on every part of it. So we see this massive bombardment of Novomykhailivka, Persha, as Russians have encroached on it from the north and from the east. The southern part is largely open areas with a far distance between the Russian positions, and a similar case. The Russians, if they wanted to close in from the south as well, would have to fight by the river line, where they need to gain control over Skushne and some of the crossings over the river line, and at that point they may as well just capture the fortified positions. Therefore, we see that the Russians are focusing on the north and the east of Novomykhailivka, Persha, where they then would move on to the fortified positions, and they wouldn't have to clear this entire area. They would simply wait for the Ukrainians to withdraw from it as they capture the fortified positions across the river crossing, leaving those completely encircled if there are any troops here to the south of Novomykhailivka, Persha. Something interesting is that the Russians never advance before they completely clear an area, and an example of that is Krasnohorivka. It is a very small town, but ever since the Russians captured it, they have not really advanced through it. According to the latest reports, they are still clearing the basements within the village, as it is very difficult to do so. You could throw a grenade down there, but you don't really know the structure of the building until you actually go inside. There could be defensive positions, there could be tunnels, a lot of other things within the town itself, so they have to go through each basement one by one as they completely clear it before they move on to the next position. So we see that the Russians have reached the outskirts of Krasnohorivka, but until they have completely cleared Krasnohorivka, they will not advance further. We see here in the direction of the northwest of Novomykhailivka, the Russians have advanced further in the direction of Vovchenka, where we see here that the Russians have reached the outskirts of the town, both in the northern and southern parts, capturing the forest lines. However, the final parts of the fortified positions is still unclear about the current positions there. It is likely that the Russians have full control of it, considering the recent advance here to the northwest and to the southwest of it. But until that we have a clear either geolocated footage or report reporting the full control of it, we'll leave it in the gray zone. But it is very likely that the Russians do have full control of it. So we see that the Russian positions is now focused on the direction of Vovchenka and Toretsk, where the heavy fighting is taking place here west of Cheretsine, as well as in the direction of Novoslavka Persha. With the capture of Vovchenka here to the west of Sokhel, we see that the Russians will now be moving on to the next part, which is the direction of Proedes and Vovche, where the fighting will take place from the railway direction here to the north and from the Vovchenka direction from the south, attacking both at the same time. However, it is clear based on the recent advances that the Russians are focusing on the north and the south first before they move in a central position. In the direction of New York, there's been no further advances within the town itself. However, to the south of Yurivka, the Russians are moving in a western direction. This is to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions here to the south, where they look to gain control over that, strengthening the western flank of the positions the Russians have made here to the south of New York. The weakness of the Russians right now is that the Ukrainians can launch counterattacks here to try and cut off the Russian soldiers within the town itself and reestablish the positions within New York, preventing a further or stronger Russian push within the town itself. This is why the Russians are now launching operations to strengthen the flank and prevent that from happening. They would need to push and gain control over the forest patch area here to the southwest, as well as the ones here west of Yurivka. And with the apartment complex area under their control, they would already have secured their foothold within the town. Therefore, these two areas here west of their position, and to gain control over the area here to the east by gaining complete control over the 2014 line of defense, they would be able to completely secure their positions here within New York. It is clear based on the fighting taking place here within the eastern parts of Toretsk and in the New York direction that the Russians are looking to close and gain control over the entirety 2014 line of defense, the final parts of it, by connecting the northern and southern parts, gaining control over New York, and then connecting it with Toretsk by launching an assault in that direction, would completely cut off all of the Ukrainian positions, forcing them to withdraw. It is likely that the entirety of the eastern part of New York is already being withdrawn towards the town itself, while the northern parts here by Vovchenka and so on are likely also going to be withdrawn to strengthen the defenses within Toretsk, which would leave the entire area within the Russian control and strengthening the Russian positions in the area. If it strengthens the Russian position in the area, why would they do it? Because if the Russians are to launch assault to the east, they would take heavy losses doing so, but they're not really doing so. Therefore, generally, the entire area would be stronger for the Russians as they would gain control over the fortified positions. However, locally within New York, the Ukrainians would have a better chance at holding back the Russians and stalling for time until either further reinforcements arrive to launch a counterattack or for them to withdraw from the town and avoid encirclement. So it would be a short-term loss for the Ukrainians to withdraw, but a long-term benefit. Similarly, if the Russians are able to completely cut off the Ukrainian positions, it would be a short-term loss in the sense that they have to push through Ukrainian defenses, which would cause more losses, but long-term gain in the sense that if they cut off the Ukrainian positions, they would cut off a large amount of soldiers in these fortified areas. Therefore, we see that the fighting within New York and Toretsk continues heavily, and we have this video here in the direction of Toretsk from Deep State Map showing heavy fighting and heavy bombardment of the apartment complex area here in the eastern parts of Toretsk, where similarly to the Chesapeake micro district, there's a lot of apartment complex areas, and this allows the Ukrainians to hold their fortified positions. We see that the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within it. This allows the Russians to contest the Ukrainian positions here within the apartment complex areas, but it's very difficult to advance through it. So while the fighting is taking place, they are heavily bombarding it as well to cause as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainians, forcing them to send more and more troops to actually hold their positions. Otherwise, they'd need to withdraw to the second line of defense, and that would be very difficult to coordinate with the Russian positions so close by, which would constantly be hitting them during that withdrawal. And therefore they are either going to keep holding it or simply leave it and heavily bombard it, so then the Russians taking control of it and would be forced to withdraw anyways. So we see that the Ukrainian positions here in the east are also under fire while the main fighting is taking place in the apartment complex area. The Ukrainians would be forced to withdraw to the second line of defense, after which they would be withdraw from the apartment complex area and then set up their positions here in this direction. It is important for the Ukrainians to re-establish their positions here in the north, otherwise the Russian positions in Druzhba and to the east of Pivnishne would generally be allowed to flank the Ukrainian second line of defense, and completely removing the importance of it by going around them instead of through them. The Ukrainians still have the fortified positions on the hilltops, allowing them to oversee the area, which gives them a significant advantage. But this removes the advantage of the rest of the fortified positions on the second line of defense. Further north here in the direction of Verkhnokamiansk, the Ukrainians recaptured the fortified positions to the east of it, pushing the Russians out. These fortified positions have changed hands many times over the past few months, and this shows that the Ukrainians are holding on to it and counterattacking whenever the Russians attempt to gain control of it, and it goes back and forth. Further north here in the direction of Novomykhailivka, the Russians have managed to capture the eastern parts of the town, everything east of the Serebets river line, following an assault. We see that the Russians also have the control of the eastern parts of Andrivka and Vovchenka. So with this, the entirety of the Serebets river here to the north, in the eastern parts of it, is under the Russian control due to recent assaults and advances in the past 2 months. In the direction of Sinkivka, we see the Russians have advanced within the forest patch area in the west of the village, where heavy fighting takes place in it, as well as in the eastern parts where recent Russian advances have taken place as well. So we see a general attempt by the Russians to conduct positional fighting west and east of Sinkivka to improve their positions in the area and slowly move towards the next line of defense of the Ukrainians, bypassing Sinkivka entirely. In the Kharkiv section by Vovchenka, the Russians have started attacking the eastern flank as well, where they've managed to regain a foothold in the eastern parts of the town and push the Ukrainians back from gaining full control of it. The objective of the Russians here is to make use of their foothold across the Vovchenka river line and cut off the Ukrainian soldiers in the northern parts, preventing from withdrawing back across the Vovchenka river line, holding on to their foothold, and completely cutting off the supplies of the Ukrainians in the area. There's also fighting reported in the southern parts of the northern part of the Vovchenka river line and in the apartment complex area. So the heavy fighting is taking place pretty much everywhere where the Russians are launching a counterattack, where they are attempting to completely cut off the Ukrainians and regain control over the northern part of the Vovchenka river line with these recent assaults, and this eastern part negated the recent Ukrainian advance and recapture in that position. So we see heavy fighting taking place all across the front line. The Russians are attempting to put everything under their direct control by preventing the Ukrainians from launching further counterattacks, and this is happening all across the front from the Kharkiv direction in the north and down south to Krasnohorivka. But the very interesting thing about this in the north is that the Russians are able, despite the numerical disadvantage, to regain the initiative and start counterattacking the Ukrainian attempts to regain control over Vovchensk. We see that the eastern parts here, south of the apartment complex area, was always under Ukrainian control. The Russians never managed to gain control of it, but since then the Ukrainians have managed to gain massive advances here in the east of Vovchensk, as well as in the central parts. The Russians were thus then forced to continue the fighting here in the aggregate plant despite the close positions where the Ukrainians almost managed to encircle them, but they never managed to do so. And the evidence of that is the Russian positions south of the Vovchenka River line. The fact that they were able to cross over shows how powerful the position of the Russians was here in the aggregate plant, despite the pro-Ukrainian sources claiming that they were encircled. So we see that the Russians here in the south of the Vovchenka River line still hold powerful positions despite the very close proximity to the fact that they almost completely encircled. They are still able to hold on to position and make use of it to launch further offensive operations, and the Ukrainians have been unable to advance due to the heavy firepower of the Russians. This shows the effectiveness of the Russian firepower and why the Russians are launching such an operation. Despite the small number of soldiers involved, they're still able to bring forth massive advantages in the fighting. And that is all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.